The narrative of man-made climate change, relentlessly pushed as an existential crisis, really crumbles under scrutiny when confronted with empirical evidence and critical reasoning. Now, proponents of this theory, often driven by ideological agendas, political gain, or profiteering, claim that human activity, particularly carbon dioxide or CO2 emissions, is driving catastrophic global warming, rising sea levels, melting ice sheets, and extreme weather. Yet, the data paints a starkly different picture, exposing the inconsistencies and exaggerations at the heart of this movement. For instance, there's no evidence of accelerating sea level rise. One of the most emotionally charged claims of man-made climate change is that rising CO2 levels will cause catastrophic sea level rise, submerging coastal cities and displacing millions. However, historical and modern data refute this alarmism. Tide gauge records, which have measured sea levels since the 1800s, show a steady global mean sea level rise of approximately 1.7 to 1.8 millimeters per year from 1900 to 2009, with no significant acceleration attributable to human CO2 emissions. Satellite observations since 1993 indicate a slightly higher rate of 3.2 plus or minus 0.4 millimeters per year, but this is consistent with natural variability and shows no clear correlation with rising CO2 levels. Importantly, sea level rise was occurring well before industrialization, at rates comparable to today, suggesting natural processes like glacial isostatic adjustment and thermal expansion dominate over human influence. Now, claims of dramatic sea level rise often rely on speculative models rather than observed data. In some regions, relative sea levels are even falling due to land rebound from glacial retreat, further undermining the narrative of universal inundation. If sea level rise were truly an imminent threat, why do insurance companies continue to underwrite massive coastal projects? From Miami to Dubai, billion-dollar developments, hotels, resorts, and infrastructure proceed unabated, with insurers like Lloyd's and AIG showing no hesitation in covering these assets. If the risk of flooding were as dire as claimed, such investments would be deemed uninsurable. Yet the market signals confidence in coastal stability. And what about the claim of ice sheets melting? The fact is, they are actually stable and growing, and they certainly aren't collapsing. The melting of polar ice sheets, particularly in Greenland and Antarctica, is another cornerstone of climate alarmism, with claims that human-induced warming is causing rapid ice loss and driving sea level rise. Yet, recent surveys and satellite data tell a different story. In Antarctica, studies published in 2025 report a surprising pause in sea ice decline and record-breaking accumulation of ice, with significant growth due to increased snowfall. NASA's own data from 2015 showed that Antarctica was gaining ice at a rate of 112 billion tons per year, offsetting losses in other areas. While Greenland has experienced some mass loss, the rate is modest, with the Greenland ice sheet losing about 279 billion tons per year between 1993 and 2019, equivalent to a tiny fraction of its total mass. These losses are well within the range of natural variability and do not indicate a catastrophic trend. Satellite imagery further supports this. Arctic sea ice, while showing seasonal fluctuations, hasn't disappeared as predicted by models in the 2000s, which claimed an ice-free Arctic by 2013. Instead, Arctic sea ice extent in 2025 shows a surprising pause and decline. Global sea ice coverage, when combining Arctic and Antarctic trends, has remained relatively stable since satellite measurements began in 1979, with peaks in 1979 and 2015 showing no dramatic downward trend. If ice sheets were collapsing due to man-made warming, we would expect consistent accelerating losses across both poles, not the observed growth and stabilization. The other thing that strikes me as odd is the contradictions in behavior by all of these climate alarmists. If climate change proponents truly believe in imminent coastal flooding, why do they continue to invest? Why do they invest in and inhabit vulnerable areas? Prominent figures like Barack Obama, Al Gore, and John Kerry, vocal advocates for climate action, own multi-million-dollar beachfront properties in places like Martha's Vineyard, Montecito, and the Hamptons. These purchases, made well after their public warnings about sea level rise, betray a lack of personal concern about the risks they preach. If the science were settled and the threat imminent, such investments would be reckless, yet these elites show no hesitation when they're buying these huge mega mansions. Similarly, these insurance companies' willingness to cover coastal megaprojects undermines the narrative. The global insurance market, valued at over $6 trillion, thrives on risk assessment. If sea level rise were a clear and present danger, premiums for coastal properties would be prohibitive and insurers would retreat from these markets. Instead, these companies, they continue to insure developments in these low-lying areas like Miami and the Maldives, where floating homes and seawalls are being built to adapt to natural coastal dynamics, not apocalyptic flooding. These suggest that the industry, grounded in actuarial data, sees no evidence in an unimaginable crisis or an unmanageable crisis. So what's the end game here? If climate change isn't supported by data, why are so many corporate elites and government officials pushing this hoax? Well, why else? Money. The green agenda is a multi-billion-dollar industry, that pushes for the man-made climate change, has spawned this sprawling, lucrative industry fueled by these globalist agendas. The global renewable energy market was valued at $881 billion in 2020 and is projected to reach $2.1 trillion by 2030, driven by subsidies and carbon credit schemes and mandates like this ridiculous Paris Agreement. Electric vehicle companies, wind and solar manufacturers, and carbon offset firms profit handsomely from policies rooted in climate alarmism. These green industries often rely on taxpayer-funded incentives and regulations that penalize fossil fuels, despite the latter's continued dominance, which was 80% of our global energy in 2023. These financial ecosystems benefit globalist organizations like the World Economic Forum, which promotes initiatives like the Friends of Ocean Action to push low-carbon economies, often at the expense of developing nations reliant on affordable energy. The net zero goal by 2050, deemed essentially impossible by some scientists due to fossil fuels' indispensability, enriches these industries while doing little to alter global temperature. Meanwhile, the agricultural benefits of higher CO2 levels, trillions of dollars in increased crop yields, are downplayed, as are the facts that CO2 is essential for photosynthesis and that current levels are historically low compared to past geologic eras. History of failed apocalyptic predictions has gone way back, more than 50 years. Yet this climate change narrative in this last 50-year string of environmental doomsday predictions that have consistently failed to materialize, it is proof of the climate hoax altogether. In the 1970s, scientists warned of global cooling and a potential new ice age, with headlines like Time magazine's 1974 article, Another Ice Age, where they cited colder winters and declining temperatures. In the 1980s, the ozone depletion scare was dominant, with claims that aerosol sprays would destroy the atmosphere, leading to the Montreal Protocol. While ozone levels stabilized, the apocalyptic rhetoric far outstripped the actual threat. By the 1990s, global warming took center stage, with Al Gore's 2006 documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, predicting submerged coastlines and ice-free poles by the 2010s, none of which obviously has occurred. Other failed predictions include claims of mass starvation, disappearing islands, and exponential increases in hurricanes, none supported by data. For example, the UN's Food and Agricultural Organization forecasts a 30% increase in crop yields by 2050, and hurricane frequency hasn't risen significantly over the past century when adjusted for better detection. These repeated failures expose a pattern of fear-mongering where Each new crisis replaces the last to maintain public anxiety and justify control. The whole thing has really been used to create voter panic. In the U.S., the Democratic Party has weaponized climate change hysteria to galvanize its voter base, framing it as an existential threat requiring sweeping governmental intervention. This tactic leverages fear to rally younger voters and progressives who are more likely to prioritize environmental issues. A 2023 Pew Research Center survey found that 37% of Americans think climate change should be a top priority, with Democrats far more likely than Republicans to agree. By casting climate change as a moral imperative, Democrats justify policies like the Green New Deal, which propose trillions in spending while offering little measurable impact on global temperatures. This fear-driven approach mirrors historical scare tactics like the 1970s overpopulation panic or the 1980s nuclear winter fear, each used to push expansive government programs. Climate change's vague long-term predictions make it an ideal tool for political manipulation, as it's nearly impossible to disprove in the short term. Yet the lack of consensus among scientists, contrary to the oft-cited 97% figure, which stems from flawed surveys, reveals the debate is far from settled. A 2022 Pew survey noted that 23% of Americans have little trust in climate scientists, reflecting widespread skepticism. And who can blame them? The same people funding the climate scientists are the same ones who told us that you couldn't spread a certain virus if you took a certain vaccine. But what does the empirical data show, like temperature trends? Satellite data from NASA since 1979 show a modest warming trend of 0.14 degrees Celsius per decade, far below model predictions. Some regions, like Antarctica, have cooled by 0.88 degrees Celsius over 50 years, inconsistent with global warming theory. And how much of a role does CO2 really play? Well, CO2 is a weak greenhouse gas compared to water vapor, which accounts for 95% of the greenhouse effect. Historical CO2 levels were far higher during the Cambrian era, without catastrophic warming. Then there's natural variability. Earth's climate has always fluctuated, with warm periods like the medieval warm period and cold periods like the Little Ice Age occurring without human influence. Ice core data show CO2 often lags temperature increases, suggesting it's a consequence, not a cause of warming. And of course, we have the urban heat island effect. Much of the reported warming in urban areas is due to paved surfaces and buildings, not global CO2 levels. The truth is, the man-made climate change narrative is a house of cards built on selective data, fear-mongering, and profiteering. This green agenda has birthed trillion-dollar industries that thrive on subsidies and mandates, while a half-century of failed predictions from global cooling to ozone holes exposes the pattern of exaggerated crisis. Democrats wield climate hysteria as a political cudgel, yet the empirical evidence, modest warming and natural variability, and CO2's limited role debunks their claims. It's time to reject their dogma, scrutinize the science, and prioritize truth over ideology. The planet is resilient, and humanity's ingenuity will outlast this manufactured panic.